So, if you're unaware, the Five Nights at Freddy's 1 trailer has reached its 7-year anniversary last month. And looking back on this game's past can really show how although the point-and-click gameplay was never really innovated on, the game series as a whole has evolved in such a way that you can distinctly know which game is which just by a screenshot of the office. Wait, that's not right. I don't think this is an office in any of the mainline Five Nights at Freddy's games, at least what I can remember. That's because it isn't. This office is from the 2015 fan game known as Five Nights at Candy's, which you all have probably heard of. One of the first FNaF fan games that really set an example for what a fan game to Scott Cawthon's titular series can be. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. With the series, and by proxy, the community about to hit the home stretch of 10 years, I want to look back at the history of fan games for this franchise. As I've been being around since the Five Nights at Freddy's 3 era, I've seen the rise of some of the most quality and original Five Nights at Freddy's fan games out there. Some people even say that the most top quality ones are better than anything that Scott's even made. We'll get to that claim later and why I feel it's a little misinformed. Another thing is obviously don't take my opinions on these games as if they are fact. I'm not a developer and I know absolutely nothing about code, so all my viewpoints are coming from a strictly player perspective. And, of course, I cannot cover every single FNaF fan game out there. If you go on GameJolt, the FNaF tag has over 1,000 entries, making it one of the biggest tags on the entire site. But that also raises the question, what was the first Five Nights at Freddy's fan game anyway? When asked the question on what the first FNaF fan game is, many people point to the demo of Five Nights at Treasure Island, a game based off the abandoned by Disney creepypasta with the gameplay loop of Five Nights at Freddy's. It was definitely a relic of its time and hasn't aged that well, but for the very first FNaF fan game released a mere 5 months after the first Five Nights at Freddy's, it's a fairly solid demo. I would go more in depth with it if Noodle Limb Girl aka Steals My Idea Before I Can Make Them First aka gomotion didn't make 2 whole videos about the game and its 2021 remake. And trust me, we'll definitely get to that later. But as I said, for being the first Five Nights at Freddy's fan game, Treasure Island is still relatively impressive. Is what I would say if it actually was the first Five Nights at Freddy's fan game. Yeah, so despite popular belief, if you go to GameJolt and sort the FNaF tag all the way back to the very first FNaF fan game, you won't be met by Treasure Island. Instead, you'll be met by Freddy Fazbear. Oh my god, I can't say the name with a straight face. Instead, you'll be met by Freddy Fazbear's Pizza Massacre, which is exactly like it sounds, and was released a whole month before Treasure Island. Hell, it even predated FNaF 2 by a measly 5 days. And it's bad, I don't know what to say. I can see why this usually doesn't get credited as the first FNaF fan game when the discussion is brought up, because although a very interesting piece of history, this is just weird, man. Obviously, no offense to the creator, as they have probably well forgotten about it and left it rotting in the hellhole known as the GameJolt FNaF tag, as the first thing that contributed to much bigger things going forward. This time period was sort of a Wild West era for Five Nights at Freddy's. There wasn't really an established lore or accurate fan-made models yet, so I really only had to go off of what the first 2 games gave us, and speculate and create rumors for what may be next. All until Five Nights at Freddy's 3. Wait. That isn't what FNaF 3 looks like. Oh dear lord, that's not the FNaF 3 office, and oh my god, I made this joke already, what the hell is going on? Well, if you were around when the FNaF 3 hype was at its peak, you may remember this hoax game that came out that was branding itself as the real Five Nights at Freddy's 3, until Scott himself came in to tell the creator to change the name to something else so it won't be as misleading. And this here was the birth of probably the most infamous FNaF fan game series to date. The Return to Freddy's, just like Freddy Fazbear's Pizza Massacre, is really a product of its time. The game's code runs entirely on the code of Five Nights at Freddy's 1 and 2, with 100% stolen assets all across the board. Not even just stolen assets from Scott, the game also uses Emil Mako's original Sugar the Cat model, which would go on to become Candy the Cat a year later. Tyler, the man behind the first Return to Freddy's game, eventually made a sequel around the beginning of 2015, even using his own models, which still looked like hot garbage, but were at least original. The Return to Freddy's 2 would go on to have some original characters as well, these 2 characters being Kitty Fastcat and Lockjaw. Throughout the Return to Freddy's active series life, Tyler has gotten into a fair share of controversy, and apparently just did a lot of strange things. I'm not a drama channel, so I'll keep talking about him to a minimum, but I felt the need to bring him up in some way, as I've seen him labeled as the FNaF community's yandere dev. There went on to be 5 Return to Freddy's games, with a plethora of cancelled ones as well. But just recently, a small team of developers known as Team Luminance have remade the second Return to Freddy's game just a few months back, which we will definitely talk about later, as this is my personal favorite FNaF fan game. I know I keep saying we'll talk about more interesting stuff later in the video, but that is because the majority of the prominent fan games at this time were really just pioneers for a genre that go on to become much bigger than itself. The last really prominent game to talk about from the 2014 era would be the demo to Five Nights at Wario's, which although is fairly similar to the Return to Freddy's with its quality, it's still a lot more original and has a lot of interesting mechanics, even if the game is made out of entirely just JPEGs. But that was the majority of FNaF fan games at the time, with the exception of Treasure Island. But that just about wraps up the era of 2014 Five Nights at Freddy's games. It's obvious that the realm of fan games hasn't entirely found its footing yet, with the first Five Nights at Freddy's only being 6 months old at the time. But with a new year right around the corner, what came out next? 2015 began, and it began swinging. One Night at Flumpty's is one of the most unique and nonsensical FNaF fan games to release, and I'm all for it. The first one's actual gameplay structure is basically no different than Five Nights at Freddy's, with its main mechanic being this goddamn clown. I'm not even scared of clowns, but holy hell I hate this thing. As the game states in its title, it's only one night, so outside of demos, it's also one of the shortest FNaF fan games. But what it lacks in quantity really makes up wholeheartedly in quality. The art in this game is great, and the game is just an all-around fun, comedic parody of the FNaF series. There was a sequel to One Night at Flumpty's that was released 3 months after called One Night at Flumpty's 2, which is actually more popular than the first one, and for good reason. Flumpty's 2 takes everything from the first game and makes it so much better, with more unique gameplay mechanics such as turning off the lights so an enemy doesn't spot you, or the camera having to charge. There's also a new game mode in this version called Hard Boiled Mode, which is just the same night with the difficulty amped up to make it even more of a challenge. The Flumpty series would go on to have several cancelled games, with Jonochrome eventually announcing that he won't be making any more Flumpty games in the future. All until Scott Cawthon announced the Fazbear Fanverse initiative earlier this year, with Jonochrome being one of the first to join, announcing he will make Flumpty's 3 to finally end off the series. But due to recent events, it is unknown if Jonochrome will still continue to be a part of the Fanverse. Even if we don't get a Flumpty's 3 though, I still wish Jonochrome the best for whatever he plans on doing in the future. Another thing to note that during this time, there are a lot of big fan games to come out for their time, but not really notable to bring up in this video. Some include sequels to Five Nights at Wario's, Five Nights at the Krusty Krab, Five Nights at Sonic's, you get the idea. While this was all happening, the final version of Five Nights at Treasure Island was going through development hell. You know, just thought I'd mention that. But in the summer of 2015, possibly the most recognizable and influential FNaF fan game finally released. There is a lot to be said about Five Nights at Candy's. It's one of the first finished Five Nights at Freddy's fan games, chock through with a whole bunch of content that you would see in a mainline FNaF game, with the full Five Nights experience, a 6th night, and even a custom night and extras. Candy's takes the title of being the very first FNaF fan game to attempt to build off the mainline lore and continuity. And no, I'm not counting you. Instead of just taking another existing IP and adding a Five Nights twist, this takes place right after the events of FNaF 2. Being a rival animatronic entertainment restaurant. Think Showbiz Pizza and Chuck E. Cheese in the real world. You play as Mary Schmidt, who is possibly supposed to be Mike Schmidt, aka Michael Afton's sister in this timeline. This game is packed with stuff, including post-night cutscenes and many secrets and Easter eggs along the way. I heard that this game came to rise because of the use of Sugar the Cat, who would go on to become Candy, was being used in a lot of other early fan games without permission, most prominently in the Return to Freddy series, obviously. This caused Emil Mako to develop his own fan game to outshine all of the other competitors. Candy's would go on to get 2 more sequels, as well as a remaster and a 4th game in the works under the Fazbear Fanverse initiative. Candy's 2 was kind of the same shtick. It's supposed to take main inspiration off of FNaF 3, with the ideas of the Wizards from FNaF 2 also having a prominent role here. Taking place a few decades after the initial Candies game, you have to defend yourself from all the main animatronics from the first game again. The rat makes another appearance here as well as a new character, the cat, the two original animatronics presumably from the 60s. After that is Five Nights at Candy's 3, a prequel game that, in my personal opinion, is the best one in the series. Candies 3 is obviously a prequel game, being set in the very first location before Candies was even a thing. The main characters here being the rat, the cat, and Vinny, a puppet-like character, with the most unique gameplay out of any fan game I've played. The main gimmick of this game being the tape recorder and flashlight. If an animatronic comes after you, instead of luring them away with sounds or closing a door, you are put into this very tense set piece where you need to keep a light on the animatronic's face for a brief period of time. This game is also jam-packed with content too. I can usually beat a FNaF style game in the span of 2 hours, but with all the extra content here and post-night minigames, the game can be a lot longer of an experience than you may think when first going into it. Of course, a few years back we also did get confirmation that a Five Nights at Candy's 4, or some sort of sequel for Candies, is still in the works. And I'm sure, like every other fanverse dev working on their own projects, Emil is hard at work at delivering his final closure to the series. But speaking of fanverse devs, you know, I wasn't originally going to cover all the fanverse devs in this video, but then I realized that the majority of the most prominent FNaF fan games are made by them, so I might as well cover all of them in chronological order. A few weeks before the release of Five Nights at Candy's, Kane Carter, the man that would go on to create Popgoes, made an announcement for a Five Nights at Freddy's fan game. A year later, the game would finally come out, and I'd say it was most definitely worth the wait. The game had a lot of unique elements to how its gameplay worked, as well as a story that rivals some mainline games of how convoluted it is. You play as a robot? Yeah, unlike the regular old night guard that you thought you'd play as this game and thought you were playing as, you are instead playing as a learning-based AI named Strings, a robot made to catch Fritz's nightmares of the puppet, and yes, the Fritz from FNaF 2. Like Candies, this is another game that builds on the established lore of FNaF. In this universe, Toy Bonnie did the bite of 87, and the bite victim was Jeremy Fitzgerald, who went on to rename as Fritz Glade. The gameplay is very solid, but also some of the most confusing in a fan game I've ever played. It changes a lot from the core formula of a FNaF game, the main gimmick here being the panic meter. If you stare at the animatronics for too long, or do something as minute as flicker the cameras too fast, your panic meter will start to fill up very quickly. The only way to bring your panic meter down is to look outside the window to the right of your office. Popgoes has had a lot of cancelled sequels in the works over the past few years, with the main ones being Popgoes Repainted and Popgoes 2 The Dead Forest. But once the Fanverse initiative was announced, Kane finally landed on an idea he liked, which is now in development as Popgoes Evergreen, stated to release sometime in the near future. A neat bit of trivia is that Popgoes and Five Nights at Candy's actually share a universe. In this one, only the first 3 mainline Five Nights at Freddy's games happened. Popgoes has also had 2 smaller scale games that were released in the development cycles of both games, Popgoes Arcade and Popgoes Arcade 2, the first coming out a few months before the first Popgoes to keep the hype going, and the other one being released a few months ago while we wait for Popgoes Evergreen. And, since we're still on fanverse stuff, we should go down to what's next on the line. Before we talk about the Joy of Creation game most people know, there were 2 other Joy of Creation games before this, the original one and Joy of Creation Reborn. In the Joy of Creation storyline, you play as Scott Cawthon himself. Your job is to keep the real-life manifested versions of the FNaF characters out of your office and see how long you can survive. This version of the game was later completely scrapped by the developer Nixon. He later released the Joy of Creation Reborn, a successor to the original, and I remember this game exploded in popularity for its fresh free-roam gameplay and terrifying animatronic designs. The game got updated pretty frequently too, with new locations and animatronics, having slendered the 8 pages style of gameplay. Although you could technically beat the game, both projects were lacking in one key thing: story. And don't fret, because this is where the final game in the series, Joy of Creation's story mode, comes into play. Well, final until the Fanverse was announced, but you know what I mean. The Joy of Creation story mode is like the others. You play as Scott, and now even his family too, and you need to survive the real-life manifestations of the animatronics. This game is difficult, man. Like, really difficult. You need to be on your toes for a lot of the levels, and the basement one in particular is a lot of trial and error. I can see why this was done though. The game is very short, so to try to make it a little longer, Nixon probably decided to amp the difficulty, even if it does feel a little cheap at times. This is also the fan game that usually gets brought up when the debate sparks if some FNaF fan games are better than the official ones, being praised for all the reasons that I've been praising it up until now. We should finally get to that. Although I believe The Joy of Creation is an extremely solid game, I personally do not feel that it's better than any of the core Five Nights games. And I could easily justify this by saying something like, without the original game it wouldn't exist, so that must mean it's good. But you can say that about just anything. The reason why I feel a game like Five Nights at Freddy's 1 is a better game than The Joy of Creation just comes down to a lot of personal factors. The main two just being balancing and replayability. My main issue with The Joy of Creation is how undeniably challenging it is. And no, I'm not just saying it's bad because it's hard. I feel its difficulty does wonders for the gameplay in it. But even in the very first level, the AI feels like it's on Night 6 levels of difficult. The entire point of a FNaF-style game is for the levels to progressively get more difficult as they go on, and I feel this game misses the mark on that front. Another thing is that FNaF-style games have short enough nights to be very replayable, especially if you have Custom Night unlocked. I'm not saying that they are infinitely replayable or anything, but I sometimes find myself booting up one of the games just for a quick round of Custom Night. The Joy of Creation makes replay value kind of difficult because the game is heavily based on trial and error. Granted, most FNaF games are. The Joy of Creation, in my opinion, is still an amazing game, but I am just not really a big fan of calling them better. Call me a purist, but in my eyes, nothing can beat the originals. But unlike most fan game devs though, this isn't the only series Nixon has going on. Although not a part of the fanverse, I really thought that I should bring up Those Nights at Rachel's. This is my second favorite fan game to release. The thing I really enjoy about Nixon's games is that he uses Unreal Engine instead of ClickTeam, which makes 3D environments look a lot less stretched out, which is my biggest complaint with not just FNaF fan games, but the official ones as well. Rachel's really takes the 3D space to its advantage too, swiveling through different corners of your desk to check different monitors, as well as being able to even get out of your desk on some occasions. The game kinda shares the same problems Popgoes has though, with a lot of multitasking and such. The difficulty curve is nowhere near as bad as The Joy of Creations though. If you like the Freddy's formula, but wish you could have a bit more freedom and movement but not entirely free roam, you should definitely start here. Alright, what's next down the line? Oh, this one will be interesting. The next fan game developer isn't known for an established series they have going on, but their games have the potential of being some of the best right now. Phil Morg, who goes by FNaF Online, is a man who is responsible for the fan games A Shadow Over Freddy's and Porkchop's Horror Show. Both are some of the most atmospherically terrifying FNaF fan games I've played. Porkchops, from what I'm aware, isn't finished as of now, but there was a smaller game in the line called Porkchop's Adventure, which was released a few years back. Think Popgoes Arcade, but there's another threat you need to keep an eye on. But I think the more interesting fan game out of the two is A Shadow Over Freddy's. This game takes on a more sister location structure to its gameplay. The game has you playing as William Afton after being sent to purgatory for his misdeeds. And at the end of the night, you will be rewarded by a cutscene with a puppet. This game is probably one of the scariest on this entire list too. FNaF really knows how to nail an atmosphere with these games. You play in a twisted version of the Five Nights at Freddy's 1 location as you are hunted down by the original FNaF 1 gang. The entire game is in grayscale too, and it adds so much to the tension of it. If you're afraid of the dark, you are probably going to hate this game. I would highly recommend it to anyone looking for a FNaF fan game that really throws a left curve to how you expect a Five Nights style game to be handled. But although these two games are very interesting in their own right, what is the developer bringing to the table in terms of the fanverse? So one of the fan games FNaF was developing at the time was a fan-made remake to Five Nights at Freddy's 2. It was so good in fact that he actually got into legal trouble because it could actually be considered copyright infringement. But Scott, being the madman he is, didn't just end it there. I guess he may have saw the potential of a Five Nights at Freddy's remake, so he got FNaF on the fanverse team to develop Five Nights at Freddy's Plus. I obviously can't say much about the game now since it's not out yet, but from the little we did see about the game, it looks extremely promising. Even if some of the new redesign choices are kinda questionable, like giving Freddy pants? But yeah, about that, the redesigns for the most part are incredible. Bonnie especially looks absolutely terrifying, with a stare that can sink into your soul. I know I am definitely excited for this game, and I hope it will be able to update the original experience in really good ways. And that's all the Fanverse devs done. Is there anything else I'm forgetting? I mean, we could also talk about Final Nights, which is also a fairly popular FNaF fan game series. I'm gonna be honest, I'm not a big fan of this series. The biggest ones by far were 2 and 4, and although I feel 2 is a fairly solid game, I kinda feel it's a bit overrated. 4 is a really great one though. Any game that takes place in Fredbear's Family Diner is automatically a 6 out of 10 at least. But we are reaching the end of the video, and there are still 2 very recently released fan games that I want to talk about. Here we are, the thing I have been building up to this entire video. Treasure Island finally got its release on November 2020, after a triumphant 6 years in development. This game is honestly great. It is one of the best looking click team games I've seen, on par to only Five Nights at Candy's Remastered. Even though this game took so long to come out, I'd definitely say it was worth the wait with just how much content there is in here. Team Radiance really outdid themselves. Not only do you get the standard stuff you get in a regular Five Nights game, you also get the original demo fully playable as an unlock bonus, and a custom night that allows you to unlock characters after beating challenges. This is such a cool idea. I really hope future fan games adopt this going forward. It gives the game a lot more extra content and makes it very replayable. The story is all sorts of confusing too, but you can kinda get the gist of it. Treasure Island is definitely one of the most intriguing FNaF fan games, sheerly for its history. But on the topic of another fan game that got its well-deserved glow up, The Return to Freddy's 2, or now known as The Return to Freddy's Winter Wonderland now because it's Christmas or something. I'm just gonna call it Return to Freddy's 2 for convenience sake going forward. The Return to Freddy's 2 is one of those games that you could have never saw coming, but then it comes out and it blows you away. At first, I was so confused at the fact that this was labeled under the Return to Freddy's until I saw that it was made by an actual team of developers and not just Tyler. And I gotta say, Team Luminance really has something special here. You know how I said Treasure Island was the only click team game on par with Five Nights at Candy's Remastered? This one also takes the label of being one of the best looking click team games I've seen. And that's something I thought I'd never say in my life because when I think of Return to Freddy's, I think of this. The game itself is fairly much how you expect a classic FNaF style game to be. But this one has something that a lot of games miss the mark on: polish. Now, I believe every game that we talked about here, besides maybe some outliers, are incredibly polished games. But the thing that takes the Return to Freddy's to the extra mile is that they take the already well-established polish and expand on it tenfold. This is one of the most naturally flowing FNaF games I've played. You aren't just going to be looking at one camera forever. You need to keep track of at least 4 camera spots at all times. This game also has some of the best animation I've seen in a click team game too. Everything from the animatronics standing in the hallway to watching them twitch when they enter your office. Everything here just feels so polished. I would love to see this team work on more fan games in the future. Everyone on here certainly has a lot of talent, and if I could pick any other developer or development team to join the Fanverse, Team Luminance would definitely be my #1 pick. So that just about wraps up the history of Five Nights at Freddy's fan games. I know there is a lot more that we could have looked at here. And yeah, I know we didn't talk about some fan favorites like Dormitibus or the Jollibee series. But I feel that the games that I decided to cover here today are some of the most impactful to the history of this genre as a whole. You know, it's not every day where you see a whole subgenre of horror grow from a little game about sitting at a desk and keeping robots away from your office. It really goes to show the pure passion and dedication a lot of these developers have. And yes, even the games I spent a good time ragging on did contribute to paving the road to some of my favorite fan games today. And it's all because this community is filled with some of the most talented, creative, and just all-around cool people in any community I've probably been a part of. Not for me to get super meta at the end here, but I genuinely do believe this game franchise has brought so much to certain people's careers into video game development. I hope one day when all these developers finally decide to move on from Five Nights at Freddy's, their endeavors in the future will bring them absolutely nothing but good luck in the scene, as everyone here deserves it. In conclusion, thank you for watching. And of course, thank you Scott Cawthon. Thank you for making one of the most influential indie properties of all time, paving the road for hundreds, if not thousands of aspiring developers, artists, animators, and everything in between to make some of the highest quality community-driven content I have ever had the pleasure of witnessing. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed my ramblings. And as usual, until the next time, see ya.